thank you to the organisers again. I was going to do one of my usual data talks, and I decided not to. So I'm actually going to engage in a group therapy session. So I've been getting quite anxious about social cognition research. And since there's a bunch of smart people in the room that know a lot about social cognition, I thought you can either allay my fears and tell me why I'm being ridiculous, or maybe you can say there is a problem, but here's the answer. So what I'd like to do is to outline some of the things that worry me about the field at the moment. And some of them are quite well recognised, and I think the first that is reasonably well recognised is the terminology we use and the taxonomy of social cognition. So one thing that really annoys me is that we have two problems. We use different words for potentially the same concept. So I'm not really sure how these things differ, or if they differ, but we use lots of different terms, which is something that looks at least roughly like the same thing. This is obviously a problem if you're trying to do meta-analyses, if you're trying to put research together across labs. We also have the other problem, which is we use the same word for what look, at least to me, like very different concepts. So empathy is the word that to me describes imitation, emotion recognition, theory of mind, effective empathy, the thing I would actually call empathy, posture matching. There's a joke that there are more definitions of empathy than there are empathy researchers. And although it's not a bad joke, it's really a bad state of the field. If we're using the same words to refer to things that might have a very different genetic, neurobiological, psychological basis, then I'm not sure we know what we're talking about. Maybe each of us knows what we're talking about, but we don't know what our colleagues are talking about. And these problems, I think, are quite severe and bold, but potentially could be addressed with consensus. We can decide that this thing we're going to call empathy, and this other thing we're going to call theory of mind. But the problem is, I think we don't know what those things are. So I don't think we have a taxonomy of social cognition or social cognitive processes. We don't know how many words we need for social cognition. We don't know what those things are. So, in the natural world, we look at two things and we decide, are these the same thing? Are they same or different? And are either of those two things the same as this thing? And the work we do is to try and chop up the natural world into different bits. And I think we really haven't done that for social cognition. So this was a picture from Frankie Cappe's paper recently where they had a bunch of terms relating to social cognition or social cognitive processes. And there's lots of things here. And they were quite explicit that this is not a complete list, obviously. No one thought it would be. And I think some of the problem with working out what we should call things and how many words we need and the taxonomy is we don't know the structure of these things, how they relate to each other. And you can contrast this to intelligence. So there are a whole bunch of different tests of intelligence. And we've done really good kind of factor analytic work to take all of these, loads and loads of people, scores on loads of tests. And we've worked out that, you can really take all of this information on this side and boil down all these scores into maybe 2 or more, depending on how you do your factor analysis. Different factors, and maybe there's one thing that underlies the whole of intelligence. We've got no idea how this works for social cognition. It might look like this, it might look like something completely different. And again, I don't think if with a bit of working together, potentially we can solve this problem. We just need big numbers, we need to agree on what the tests are, and work out how to do factor analysis, which is another debate. So I think the problem of not knowing what we're talking about, like I said, really bad for collaborating across labs, really bad for putting research together. Looking at research from a historical perspective, maybe the thing that we thought empathy was 10 years ago is not what we think it is now. And what this means is, if we don't know what the psychological processes are, or neural processes, we're also not sure what we're testing. So this is, I think, the worst test in the world, the readers of mind in the eyes test. So, just one revision of this paper has been cited 3,300 whatever times. So for someone like Chris, this is not a big number. In my papers, this would be amazing. And the thing is, people have made massive claims on the basis of this test. People have demonstrated gender effects on theory of mind, mentalising, cultural, genetic, personality traits, and the neurobiological mechanisms underlying the theory of mind or mentalising. But the very same test in other papers is described as a test of emotion recognition or emotion perception or empathy or empathising. So how can it be a test of mentalising and a test of empathy unless those two words are synonyms for the same thing? And when I present this data, normally people say, well, it doesn't really matter because we've got a measure of validity of this. We know that people with autism, they can't do mentalising, they can't do this, and so therefore we know it's a test of mentalising. Ignoring the fact that that's really circular, you're justifying the claim that people with autism have a mentalising deficit using a test which you're justifying as a test of mentalising because people with autism can't do it. I don't even think this is correct that people with autism can't do this test. So we've had a theory for a while that comorbid alexithymia, which is a difficulty identifying your own emotions, is actually responsible for a lot of the so-called emotional symptoms of autism. And so we wondered if we can use this separation between alexithymia and autism to test what this is. Is it a test of cognitive theory of mind, or is it actually a test of emotion recognition, for instance? And so we had a group of people with autism, a group of people without autism, matched for levels of alexithymia, and so we could look at the effect of autism and the effect of alexithymia. And performance on this test was not at all predicted by autism, it was predicted by alexithymia. We had another test, which is more pure cognitive theory of mind, that was predicted by autism, wasn't predicted by alexithymia. So I'm not even sure that the test that we're using all the time, 331, whatever it was, citations, all of these things, if we're correct, it's one study, we might not be. But if we're correct that this has got nothing to do with mentalising, then all of these different conclusions need to be rewritten. Actually, the things we think we know about mentalising, we don't do. One of the other problems I think we have, as if we haven't got enough already, is that our definitions are often unclear and varied, and one of the big problems I think they don't do is allow us to interpret individual differences. So I'm going to try and talk about two fields, theory of mind and empathy, where I think this problem is particularly acute. So if you ask people to define what theory of mind is, you normally get this: the ability to represent mental states, whether they be one's own mental states or others' mental states. And the first question you get is, what are mental states? Well, for some people, visual perspective is a mental state, not for others. For some people, emotions are mental states, not for others. And for some people, Frankie Happe, Alan Leslie, you should really reserve that term for representation of propositional attitudes. So we're not sure what mental states are, but we've got an idea that theory of mind is the thing that allows us to represent mental states of self and others. The problem is that if this is a definition, it's a binary ability. You either can represent mental states, or you can't. And the problem is that virtually no adult will access this ability. The famous theory of mind deficit in autism, which I do agree with, it's very hard to show this practically in autistic adults, unless you find intellectually impaired individuals, and it's hard to show where the effect comes from. So I think we're kind of making progress a bit in theory of mind by recognising that we need to make a distinction between ability and propensity. So ability is when you're told to represent mental states, when you're given a particular experimental task, and you know you have to do it, how accurately can you represent the mental states, versus your propensity, which is when you're going about your everyday life, how often do you invoke mentalistic explanations for behaviour, for instance. So I think that distinction is useful, but it does highlight that we've moved away. When we do tests of individual differences in theory of mind, we're really not talking about the ability to represent mental states. What we're now talking about is how accurately can you infer the mental states of a particular person. And we're just assuming that everybody can represent mental states. So we've moved from our standard definition of theory of mind to another definition in order to interpret individual differences in this ability. And I think the problem with this is that now our individual differences reflect domain general inferential processes. So things like working memory and attention. Really hard theory of mind tasks are things like John knows that Mary believes that Peter thinks that the bus is late That's a massive working memory task. And so our individual differences are no longer in the representational structure, the domain-specific representational structure, which is what theory of mind is, the ability to represent mental states. So this has concerned me for a while, and I want to suggest a potential solution. If it doesn't go the whole way, it'd be nice to see what you think about this. So I think one way to make individual differences in theory of mind about the representational structure itself is to recognise that mental states are a product of the mind that gave rise to them. So we can actually represent a number of things about mind. People like Chris and Bacador have shown that we represent people's confidence, we represent people's working memory. States of language show something called recipient design. So if we're communicating with somebody we think has got a lower IQ than us, or a lower age, we tend to use simpler sentence structures with less working memory design, for instance. So we do represent those aspects of minds which are not mental states. So I think this is important, and I'll explain why in terms of theory of mind in a moment, but I think there's 2 points here. One is we need to think about representation of minds, not just mental states, and also think about how those minds might be represented. So there's been lots of work on faces. I find faces very boring, but this aspect of faces is really quite interesting, which is the concept of face space. So the idea is that we're exposed to a hell of a lot of faces. They all look reasonably similar, and we need to individuate them. We need to be able to say, this face is Bob and this face is Harry. And so the idea is that we represent faces within a multidimensional space. And each dimension might be, we've got kind of high-level ones here, dominance and trustworthiness. They might be width or I don't know, skin tone or difference between the eyes and the nose. And we can place faces within that space in order to individuate them. So we wondered whether we can have a similar concept for minds, so mind space. So the idea is that we have a multi-dimensional space within which we can place individual minds. And the reason why this might be useful for theory of mind, or accurate mental state inference, is that this mind space could really act like a function in terms of a computer programming term. So as input to this function would be the context the person is in, and this is filtered through mind space. So the output is the probability of various mental states. I'll give you a practical example in a moment. But the point is that the link between this and this might change depending on where you locate somebody within your mind space and the quality of your mind space. So how many dimensions it has, whether you can represent covariance, those kind of things. Let me give you a practical example that you've probably all seen before. Famous Sally Ann false belief task. Is there anybody that doesn't know what this is? You brave? Okay. So Sally and Ann, Sally's got a ball, puts in her basket, goes away, Ann comes back, thief and cow, takes the ball, puts it in her box, and you're asked where Sally will look for her marble. Now, the correct answer is that Sally put the ball in her basket, she doesn't know that the ball's gone, and so she will look in her basket. So, given no other information, that's what you should say. Sally's going to look in her basket. But now, imagine you've been told that Sally is a particularly suspicious person. So if this is a population of suspiciousness, Sally's over there. All that Sally knows is very suspicious of Anne. Then, you might think that Sally's going to look in the basket because she's going to come back and think, I've been away from the room, Anne is a thief, she likes my marble, she's going to steal it, so you look in there. Another person, their mind space might be different. They might just have more suspicious minds, whether they've been abused or whatever. And so, even though they don't know anything about Sally, the fact that their dimension has moved along, they might well decide to look in Anne's box because they think that people steal stuff. So, even though this is the classic test that we all know about, it's divorced from context. We don't know anything about Sally or Sally's mind or where Anne is in Sally's mind. That's the important thing. But yet, these kind of predictions don't seem crazy, at least not to me. If you know that Sally's really suspicious, especially suspicious of Anne. She might well look in Anne's box first of all. And I think what's useful about this Mindspace structure is that now individual differences in theory of mind, so in the ability to accurately infer mental states, are a product of representation of mind itself. So they're no longer taken from the inferential process, they're a product of the representational space. So individual differences now are due to the structure of mind space itself. How many dimensions you have? Can you represent the covariance between dimensions? Interestingly as well, can you accurately locate someone's mind within your mind space? And what's your propensity to do so? This is a new idea, it might be completely wrong, but I've got some preliminary evidence, you can see what you think of it. So I think personality is quite interesting, because I think personality is a mind type. So you go from behaviour to this latent variable, extroversion, narcissism, whatever, and that represents a type of mind. So we wonder whether people represent personality and whether they use this to aid their mental state increase. So the way we looked at this is we used the hexacode, which is just a personality inventory. It's basically like the big five, but you add this one, honesty, humility. And very kindly, the people that developed this task gave us the data, their validation data. So we had nearly 3,000 people, and we had data on how people rated themselves. So what we wanted to know is how well do people know the covariance in a large sample between items on this test. So we know, for example, on average, how likely is it that someone who people often call a perfectionist would also be someone who can't help worrying about little things sometimes. So, emotionality dimension, conscientious dimension. We know the real value of this in this nearly 3,000 sample. And what we asked our participants to do was to tell us the relationship, in essence, using this kind of scale. They had to say whether it's extremely likely, extremely unlikely, or even likely, or unlikely. And we attached, did I do that? We attached
correlation.
Exactly. We attached values to this, and so if they suggested it was here, how's that you? Then we calculated the difference score between the actual value in their population and their judgments. So we had an idea of how well people understood the covariance related to personality in the population. We then gave them theory of mind task, and moved for assessment of social cognition, and what we were wondering, in this sample of about 60 people, was whether we can find a relationship between mind space, between people's understanding of the structure of personality in the population, and their ability to accurately infer mental states. And we could. So, it's only preliminary data, but this suggests a relationship between the ability to understand the structure of personality and to make accurate mental state influences. So this suggests that our quality of mind space, or quality of representation of mind space, might be a determinant of individual differences in theory of mind, and it puts these individual differences in representation of minds rather than these inferential processes. I think there's really interesting things about the other mind effect. So you probably know about the other face effect. So the idea is that we're particularly poor at individuating faces that are not from our ethnic group. And this is thought to be a product of face space. So you optimize face space for the population of faces to which you are exposed. And so you're particularly poor at individuating faces from outside your ethnic group. You might find a similar effect in mind space, such that if somebody's of a different level of education, different political persuasion, see this a lot on Twitter, that you're particularly poor at having a detailed representation of their minds, and particularly poor at inferring their mental states. It's only a hypothesis at the moment, but one that we plan to test. So that's theory of mind, and if I can have another 5 minutes, yes. I'd like to talk a bit about empathy. So I think there's exactly the same problem in empathy. So empathy is another area where we don't really know what it is. Like I said, there's a billion different definitions of empathy. Something that most definitions kind of agree on is this requirement for a shared state. So the idea is that another state, so whether that's pain or something like that, causes you to enter into a matching state. So what's interesting about this requirement for empathy to have occurred is that two things has to happen. So firstly, you need to be able to work out what state they're in. Well, they're in a state. If I don't know that you're in pain, I obviously can't have empathy for you. So this emotional identification, we call it emotion recognition if you like, is really important. But this is not the whole story. Obviously, once I've worked out that you're in pain, then there needs to be this affect sharing or emotion resonance or whatever you want to call it. So I need to work out what you're feeling, and that needs to cause me to feel the same thing. But this is a real problem, because then how do we conceptualize individual differences in empathy? If two things are required, and they need to be operating pretty much perfectly, for empathy to even have happened, because you need to be in the shared state, then how do we conceptualize individual differences in empathy? And Essie's already basically talked about this. Let's imagine a patient that consistently misrecognises pain and anger. So when they see an angry person, they think they're in pain, and vice versa. So when they see an angry person, they get a huge empathic pain response. And when they see someone in pain, they don't. Now this person does not meet the definition of empathy. They are not in the same state. This different one, patient B, they're fully able to identify someone's state. They know someone's in pain, but feel no response whatsoever. Both of these two people lack empathy, but it should be pretty obvious they do so for entirely different reasons. And in a clinical context, you might want to use... we might want to use very different interventions, I know. So how do we solve this? So one way is very simple, we just change the definition of empathy. So rather someone else's state causing you to be in a matching state, we change the definition such that you need to be in the state that you identify in another. So if someone's angry, but you think they're in pain, and that causes you to feel pain, then we should say that that person has empathy. Now, this is problematic because it's not the way that lay people talk about empathy, and it's not the way that we've been researching empathy for the last God knows how long. So that's one suggestion, but let's park that for a moment. Maybe we shouldn't ever talk about individual differences in empathy. Maybe we should never talk about that. Maybe we should just talk about individual differences in emotional identification versus affect sharing. And I think the important thing is that whether you go for this or this, empirically, the implications are exactly the same. You need two different ratings or two different measurements. You need to find out what the person thinks the empathic target, what state they're in. Are they in pain? Are they angry? Are they disgusted? And how the empathizer feels in response. And we have some existing tasks which claim to measure empathy, but hopefully you agree that they really don't. So this empathic accuracy task, developed by, I think, William Ikes, Jan Wozlacki's used this a lot. This is a task where you get people in the lab and you interview them about some emotional experience, and while they're doing that, they give you this online rating of how they feel. And this is your ground truth. This is your stimulus material, which you then give to another bunch of people. And this bunch of people watch the videos, and they provide a rating of how that person feels. Now this is called the empathic accuracy task, and instead it's a measure of empathy. But to me this is quite clearly a measure of emotion recognition or identification. Can you work out what someone's feeling? And so the correlation between what you think they're feeling, what they are actually feeling, is this measure of emotional identification. But if we adapted this task such that you also provide a rating of how you feel while watching this person, and we do a correlation between your ratings of how you feel and not how that person actually felt, but how you thought they felt, then you get a nice measure of affect sharing. And this is all kind of fine in concept. Let's look at it in practice. So Klaus and collaborators had a couple of very nice papers published recently. They wanted to look at the relationship between one's own ability to feel pain and empathy. So they use a number of different manipulations, all very nice, very cool stuff, which they claimed showed that if you lower somebody's ability to feel pain, this is one experiment, which is placebo analgesia, then you interfere with their ability to show empathy. So there's this paradigm when they got a cue suggesting that a loved one was going to get a shock or not. Then they saw their loved one's face was either pained if they're receiving a shock or not pained if they weren't. And they provided 2 ratings. And the reason why I'm talking about this study is because they it wasn't the point of the study, but they did exactly what I want them to do. So they asked people to rate how painful the stimulus was for this person, and how unpleasant it felt for them when the other person was stimulated. And the conclusion of this paper was that if you reduce your own pain experience through this placebo analgesia experiment, then you reduce empathy. So both of these 2 ratings were reduced. I'm not sure this is true. So if you just look at this rating of the other person's pain, this ability to do emotional identification, you see it reduces. But under the framework that we're proposing, which is by Essen, this affect sharing component is the degree to which the other person's state predicts your state. And what you can see is that how unpleasant it is for you drops in accordance with your rating of the other person's pain. So I would say this shows an effect on emotional identification, not on this affective sharing component. And you can investigate this statistically. So we ran a mediation model, clouded data, and there's also an author on this framework, where we looked at this self-oriented rating, this empathic response, how unpleasant it is for you, and we could show that 93% of the effect of the placebo analgesia manipulation was actually explained by an effect on emotional identification. So this doesn't impact empathy, it doesn't impact affect sharing. What it does is reduce your ability to, in essence, detect pain in other people. And I think this is important. There's been a number of studies, there's a study by John Dossetti, suggesting that medics, physicians, downregulate their empathy for pain. And I think, actually, in this kind of framework, it's much more likely that after being exposed to people in absolute agony, you actually don't think a tiny cut, which is the stimuli they normally use, is actually that painful. And if you don't think people are in as much pain, you're not going to get such an empathic response. So what are the implications of this? Well, I think there's some interesting ones. So your ability to identify someone else's emotion might depend on the signal you have. If you just have a picture of an emotional face and you're really bad at processing facial emotion, you might have incredibly bad emotional identification. If you have a kind of a vignette, a story, maybe you'll be really good. If you understand the context, if you've felt what it's like to lose a child, for instance, you might have a much better understanding of someone's state that also lost a child. And it might depend on the particular person that you're asked to empathise with. I think this affect sharing function is quite interesting because you can plot the amount of empathic response, if you want, and the intensity or the degree of unpleasantness identified in the other, and get this nice function. And I think there's a number of interesting things about this function. One is the slope, how much does other people's distress influence you? One is the intercept, how much of the other person's distress do you need to show any kind of empathic response? And the other one is the shape of the function. But I think what this means kind of on a bigger level is that we can't really talk about individual differences in empathy if they don't mean anything. We should talk about individual differences in emotional identification or affection. So in summary, the reason why I have this anxiety, I think we need an agreed lexicon. We need to work on the taxonomy and structure of social cognitive processes. And I recently learned about the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, this idea that all philosophers get together and kind of worked on this online resource where they say what empathy is, what theory of mind is, what all these philosophical concepts are. And maybe as social cognition researchers we should do something similar. So at least we know what each other's talking about. I think we need to think about representation of minds when we're trying to understand the accuracy of mental state inference. You don't need to endorse Mindspace for this. people can still represent minds without those minds being represented in a multidimensional space. I think the empathy stuff suggests that the way we conceptualise empathy potentially needs changing, at the very least the way we measure it needs changing, and I think all of these will allow us to adopt an integral differences framework. I think I'm in time. Thank you very much.